Good evening, everyone. At the time we set this event, we were considering an appropriate subject line and a topic. And I assure you I had no divine intervention in recognizing that the caption of a fireside chat would prove more than appropriate on an occasion such as today, with the weather being what it is. A welcome to all of you this evening. It's thanks to our members and partners that these events have become an institution at SAC and CHAM. And when we had the privilege of meeting our acting High Commissioner in December last year at his residence, he had literally just set foot on South African soil. One of his comments to me was, "I'm looking forward to engaging your members and partners." And I didn't realize it would be as soon as this, High Commissioner. So we are very grateful to you this evening for giving your time to share some perspectives on your 180 days just about in South Africa. I think it's an exciting time in the South African history, and we are looking forward to hearing your perspectives, having been with us all just short of 6 months now. So without any further ado, High Commissioner, I'm going to hand over to you. There will be an opportunity for questions, so please send your questions through on the chat line. We will also have an opportunity to use the raise the hand facility. So let's turn this into an interactive session, as I'm sure that is exactly what the High Commissioner is looking forward to. So over to you, High Commissioner.
Thanks very much, Mike. And as you said, it's been about 180 days that I've been here, and it's gone in the blink of an eye. I have to say that I wouldn't recommend starting a new job in the middle of a pandemic. It's been somewhat challenging, unusual, but I have to also say that in spite of it, we've made good progress in the relationship between South Africa and Canada, which we're going to talk about tonight. And I wanted to say as well, I've had great support from you, from the Chamber, and of course my team here, led by Marcello. But in general, I've actually been surprised by the support in Canada. And I don't know if it's because people are a bit nostalgic for South Africa, or there's a new or revived interest in Africa as a whole. But I have called many different institutions in Canada, some of them public, some of them private. And the inevitable answer that I get when I ask, are you interested in South Africa, is I sure am. What can I do to engage more in South Africa and the region? And I've served in a number of countries, and I've served most recently in the European Union and then in Turkey and so on. And there's always interest by Canadians in international activity. But I have to say, with respect to South Africa, I've never heard such enthusiasm. So I think I said it to you maybe even 6 months ago. My impression of our relationship when I first arrived here is a little bit of cousins who knew each other when they were teenagers or kids, and they used to play together and they had a good time whenever their parents brought them together, which was maybe once a year or something. I used to have cousins like that in California. And then you kind of drift apart as you become adults and life moves on. With a little bit of that here, because we were quite close, particularly back in the 1990s and during the anti-apartheid struggle. And a lot of the institutions in both South Africa and Canada resemble each other. The most recent of those, of course, is the Constitution itself of South Africa, which is 25 years old, I believe, as of last or 2 months ago. Canadian jurists had a big hand actually in writing that. And there's a lot of goodwill towards Canada because of the role we played on things like that and bringing democracy and a fresh way of approaching things. So all of that to say, it's been a really good 6 months, I think, for me personally and for my wife. We haven't seen quite as much of South Africa because of the pandemic as we would have liked, naturally, but looking forward to seeing much more. But I'm also really impressed by the strength that's in the relationship. The sinews that we built over the years are still there, and by the interest in going beyond in all kinds of other areas. And that's what I'd like to come back to. But maybe before I do that, just a quick recap of what we're on the threshold of now and what we've gone through over the last 6 months. So obviously we're both still struggling with the pandemic, but in Canada's case, the economy is starting to show more than green shoots of revival. It's actually coming along quite quickly. This year, the expected growth could be up to 5.8, even 6%, and maybe up to almost 4% the following year. It had dropped over 5% the preceding year. We have a big deficit that we have to cover, but so that deficit and the budget, which we saw, the federal budget in April, is going to be directed toward what we're calling a green recovery. There's $17 billion Canadian that's going to be directed towards that. 2.6 billion of that will be for the international system for climate finance and biodiversity and those kinds of issues. So I think that's positioning us well for what's coming. We've also had a big change of government in our next door neighbor in the United States, and a return to a somewhat more normal relationship with them, and their renewed leadership in the world, I think, is being welcomed as well. That's particularly important for Canada. We are almost unique in the world in having one giant neighbor like that, so it matters a lot to us. And they've already begun to engage multilateral on things like the climate summit that President Biden held at the end of April, where we committed with the US to a whole series of new measures. This is a big year on climate and on the environment, and that has a major impact on business, and I think a very positive impact on business and our relationship. This year in the fall, after a delay of a year last year, will be COP26. So this is the Paris Climate Accord meeting. We're all trying to push the carbon emissions down, but as we push them down, I think we're building the clean tech up, and that's something I want to come back to. We have another conference, COP15, which is on biodiversity, and also there are many elements there which might have an interesting impact on our relationship and on business. In terms of the next steps coming up, we will, of course, expect to see the US border opening in the not too distant future. It's been closed to all but business traffic or freight, but the normal intercourse across the border has been shut for over a year. So lots of Canadians and lots of business hampered by that. So we're looking forward to that moving along as our vaccinations on both sides of the border increase and the effects of the pandemic decrease. We've now got about a 9.1% as of 2 days ago of our population fully vaccinated. But that's moving up, but in terms of a single vaccination, I think we're the highest in the G20, and we're quickly coalescing with the US. We're talking about, our health minister was speaking about it yesterday, ending the hotel quarantine, hotel of 3 days required to stay in if you were coming from abroad to Canada, looking to remove that possibly next month. We have no word on what the Europeans are doing, modeling on that. They have vaccine passports in 7 countries. We haven't got that far yet in Canada, we'll see. We are talking about and are putting quite a bit of money towards the production of vaccines in Canada, and I'll come back to that in connection with South Africa in a minute. About $2.1 billion, I believe it is, has been allocated for that. We are a bit like South Africa, which is going to have local elections in October. We are expecting to have elections, at least in the bureaucracy. We're expecting elections in the not too distant future, possibly in the fall. It might be later, but that's very much out there. As you will have heard, we had a tragedy revealed last week when the bodies of 215 children, the remains of 215 children, were found at the Kamloops Residential School. There was a series of residential schools across Canada for almost a century where Native children were separated from their parents and often subject to abuse. We had our own Truth and Reconciliation Commission look at that and report on it a few years ago, but the wounds are still there, and this was the fresh reopening of that scar last week. Unfortunately, there'll probably be more, but again, a parallel with South Africa, we have to somehow cope with the past and deal with these issues. And the whole anti-discrimination equity movement is very strong in Canada at the moment. Some of that flows from Black Lives Matter, which took off last year in the US, but also we had Indigenous groups that were active before COVID hit, blocking railways and so on. So there's a great demand for more justice and a fresh look at how we should handle these issues. I think we're a little bit smug in Canada, and we've had to reevaluate. So that's something that's very important, and I'll come back to that again when we talk about parallels with South Africa. South Africa itself, of course, unfortunately, we seem to be entering a third wave, which has a growing positivity rate, 13%, I understand. I guess the good news from that is that most predictions have it ending in 2 or 3 weeks. So hopefully we'll see the crest soon. And the vaccination rate, of course, is picking up. There's over 1.5 million people now vaccinated. The economy is starting to pick up as well, 1.1% growth this quarter. I mentioned, of course, local elections coming up. That can have effects on an economy, as it would in Canada as well, when people start to really campaign. One of the areas which we've been watching very carefully, because it is going to have a major impact on the economy of South Africa, is the fourth industrial revolution and the transition from a coal-based economy, an economy based on coal for electricity at least, and how that's going. And just on Friday, there was a meeting of President Ramaphosa's Commission on Climate Change Coordination. That's a body that brings together, I think, 7 cabinet ministers, ESCOM, and many, many others. And I believe the outcome, and I've been checking with the people who were chairing the meeting and others in the president's group, I think the outcome was positive and more ambitious on setting targets. And those more ambitious targets will help, I think, South Africa. There is a risk of a carbon border adjustment being imposed by other countries, so it will help to mitigate that. And I think more importantly, will facilitate the transition to the fourth industrial revolution and those areas which offer many, many opportunities for Canadian and South African business. At the heart of that, I'm told by everyone I've spoken to, is the need for a just transition, which is to say that the 90,000 workers in the coal industry, their families, and the towns that they support, there has to be a way forward for them. It can't simply be that they are left without work. In Canada, we also adopted much more ambitious climate change targets last fall, and then increased them again with the budget and other measures in April. We're aiming for a 40 to 45% reduction in carbon emissions by 2030, which is significant. We aim to phase out coal by 2030. Of course, we're not so reliant on coal for electricity as you are, so it's a different measure. But nevertheless, our ambition has increased significantly. So we seem to be heading in a convergent direction on climate change. One of the other elements that we've been watching with interest is corruption and anti-corruption here. We've been talking to the National Prosecuting Authority, for example. We have one project that is working with South African officials on building integrity and ethics in government, which is going now quite well. And encouragingly, our trade is up. It has actually improved quite a bit in spite of the pandemic. Over 2020, we went from 1.3 billion to over 2 billion, and about 800 million in services, although our figures are a bit delayed on that, but $3 billion in trade is not insignificant. And our investment is coming inward to South Africa is reasonable. It's more significant going to Canada. But I think overall the economic relationship is quite strong. It's strong in mining, it's strong in agriculture, and in a number of other areas which I'll come to in a moment. So those basics are looking quite good. So what do we expect in the next 6 months? And I should mention before I go there that we had very successful bilateral consultations a few weeks ago with DIRCO, the South African Foreign Ministry, chairing on your side. But we spent 6 hours in these discussions. It was a hybrid event, which had never been done before. So some of us in South Africa met together, and then we had Canadians online. And we went over political subjects, of course. We went over your relations and our relations with third countries, China, the US, etc. But probably the most interesting part of those discussions were the working groups, including the ones that you're involved in. And we had working groups on science and technology, on environment, and all of the principals came away from this, and these are the deputy ministers at that level, very impressed by the breadth and the depth of the relationship. I don't think anybody had expected it to be so important, so significant. And so we created a very good atmosphere for the next steps. Now, technology and the pandemic seem to go together. So if there is one silver lining to the pandemic, it's that we're a lot less frightened by technology, especially by virtual platforms. So in the past, we had delayed these bi-national consultations because we had to have everything perfect. We had to have the visits, we had to have the security, we had to have the protocol. Inevitably, when you get senior levels involved, something else comes up, there's an emergency, etc. And for a Canadian coming to South Africa, you know, it can be up to 20, depending where you're coming from in Canada, up to a 24-hour flight to get to South Africa, and then you're jet lagged and you've got other commitments. So we opted for this virtual platform, partly because we had to, but partly because it actually made sense. And now what we've agreed is that let's not let the perfect be the enemy of the good. Let's have much more regular consultations where we would consult with the business community, and let's start holding them every 6 months, not in the full scope version, but a smaller scaled down version where we can check in, see where we've made progress, look forward to new progress, and then perhaps 6 months or a year later, we would have the full event with all of the working groups and all the participants taking part. So that's what we agreed, and that set the stage for, I think, a lot of action in the next 6 months. So where do we go in the next 6 months? Well, starting tomorrow, we have the G7 in the UK. We expect that there will be a bilateral between President Ramaphosa and Prime Minister Trudeau. As you know, South Africa has been invited by the United Kingdom, which is hosting the G7. And they'll have a good, solid conversation if it happens. We can't guarantee that it will, but I think it's quite likely. Among the topics they will discuss, of course, political topics and security topics, but I'm sure they will get into our economic relationship and into science and technology, and probably some discussion of climate change, and of course, COVID and the response to it. And so I think that's going to be very interesting. That'll be the second, I believe, time they've spoken in the last few months, as well as our foreign ministers and others who have engaged. We will have follow-on action on climate. I think climate, as I said, brings in not only the need for South Africa, in your case, to move past coal, but also where we can scale up on clean technologies. We had recently across Africa a clean tech conference. We've got a lot of companies engaged in that area on solar, for example, but in many other fields as well. And I think what we'll look to is to combine those technologies with other sectors, because every sector can benefit from greener technology. If you don't, even if you are not convinced that climate change is the issue of the day, you probably will be convinced if the cost of energy for your business is going to be reduced. And of course, given the technology's acceleration and the rising prices for electricity, and then a carbon tax as well, for many businesses, finding a green solution is just good business sense. So I think the opportunities are going to be coming up in that area increasingly quickly. As I was mentioning, I used to be in the European Union. I was our acting head of mission there. There's a great deal of money that the European Union is putting aside for green transition. Of the 750 billion euro that they had allocated last August, over 36% of that has to be for green initiatives. There's a great deal of money internationally as well. As I mentioned, even Canada's put several $1 billion towards multilateral climate financing issues. And so I think we're going to be quite active on seeing how we can match up that money, of which there's quite a good deal out there, with the projects in South Africa that require it. And so we're trying to find that match. I think that's going to be a challenge over the next few months, but it's one that's, I think, very, very encouraging and opens many business opportunities. Science and technology, I mentioned that a couple of times. I think of all the things we've been talking about over the last few months, it's in this field that we've actually been most pleasantly surprised by what's going on. And we've had a brand new memorandum of understanding between South Africa's NRF, the National Research Foundation, with Canada's MyTechs to facilitate the exchange of researchers. Those researchers can be looking at fields that will be good for business in the transition to the fourth industrial revolution. It could be in things like hydrogen, for example. There's a lot of activity on that in both Canada and in South Africa as an up-and-coming alternative fuel. But we've had a lot of activity there. We have an MOU that's quite recent between ICID and its counterpart in South Africa, which is DSI. They hosted a webinar a few weeks ago now on vaccine production, which is, of course, the topic the whole world is very interested in. Unfortunately, Africa is still the recipient of just 1% of the vaccines that have been jabbed in people's arms so far. So we've got to do more work on that. And one of the recipients of a lot of attention I was speaking to just a couple of days ago is Aspen Pharmaceutical, which is on our board as well. But there's a great deal of interest and activity going on to build up more local manufacturing capacity so that we have more alternatives of supply, so that we can not only deal with COVID, but what happens after COVID, or what variant of COVID do we have to deal with? But there are many, many other diseases in Africa and elsewhere that we're going to have to address. So I think that's a very interesting area, how the health sector is going to come together. And we are having these conversations, which will be supported by these memorandum of understanding, which will facilitate research. On agriculture, another a surprise in a way, perhaps, of the pandemic. We've seen strong growth in commodities like agriculture and in mining over the last few months. I think this is another area where we can do much more. In South Africa, I was talking to the Namibian High Commissioner yesterday. Namibia too is very interested in developing its agriculture sector, but this is a field where we can do a lot. One of the other areas that I'm very interested in personally, and it keeps coming up in conversations, is skills development and education. Now, for a variety of reasons, we don't have very many South Africans going to school in Canada, university, colleges, or high schools. That's a bit of an anomaly because in the largely English-speaking world, Nigeria, Australia, the US, Canada, UK, you see a lot more students. And Canada, before the pandemic, had actually 750,000 foreign students resident in Canada, which was huge for us, but very few coming from South Africa. So I think what we're interested in on that side is perhaps taking another look and seeing, well, why is that? And are we not getting to the right people? Are we looking in the right places? It may mean that we have to address some educational gaps so that they have a chance and opportunity to come to Canada. It might mean that some of our institutions should come to South Africa. Now, one of the conversations I also had this week was with the head of our Social Sciences and Humanities Research Council, which is our big granting organization for that side. They work very closely with the Sciences Research Granting Foundation in Canada. Also, consistent with what I said at the outset, very interested in working with South Africa. They have done work here, but really want to channel it, make it strategic, and many exciting things happening. But again, we emphasize that, if we're looking to bring out new researchers, let's not just go to the same old pool. Let's try to find people who are out there who might not have had access, who might not have thought about working in these fields and or of Canada. So I think education will be looking at that carefully. There is, of course, the core of our investment here, which is mining. But we've had a number of conversations with the Mining Association here and in Canada about where we go with this. So on the one end, a very exciting time as we enter this transition of the economy to the use of the new metals, the platinum and so on, but also a concern that the costs of mining are rising. Canada, we will go to the second highest carbon tax in the world, just below that of Norway. So for a mine in a remote area, it becomes very expensive to use diesel. So I think we have a shared interest in controlling the energy costs. And so what we're looking at in that area, we'll call this green mining, is bringing together some of the clean tech with mining technology. And we're looking at holding a webinar later this summer in August, your winter, and perhaps follow that with a series of repackaging how we think about mining, focusing as well on Canada, ensuring that it provides the best practice in things like regulation, in CSR, and in good governance, which are so important now to mining virtually everywhere. But I think we want to open a new chapter in how we support mining and bring our two mining communities together and marry some of these technologies. In addition, well, I mentioned health. I think there's a lot of opportunity there. Perhaps what we find is that to create viable local manufacturing, we have to find ways in which our health sector can be partnered with the South African sector. There's two middle powers, two middle-sized countries. Together, their manufacturing capacity in vaccines, for example, which is only one element of health, but one that everyone's focused on, maybe that can become more viable in economic terms on a global level. Those are the kind of questions that we need to look at. Throughout all of this, we have to look at that question of equity. So gender equity, that remains a priority for Canada, a top priority as it is in South Africa. We see everything through a gender lens. We have had a number of projects recently that have supported women SMEs, for example, to give them better access to finance, to understand mentoring or get better mentoring, frankly, to deal with those sectors where the men still push back a bit We had a recent seminar on this, and it was very successful, but we'll be pushing on the gender equity piece. And then for, and some of them are difficult for Canada, you've got a lot more experience in this. How do we bring in people from disadvantaged groups in a way that allows them to develop the skills, to have a fair shake, to get those promotion opportunities? We actually just concluded this week a study of our own High Commission to see how we were doing. And a number of, we did well, I have to say, but there were a number of areas that were pointed out to us that we could do even better. So I think throughout what we do, and I mentioned it in the case of education, if we're going to talk about research and education, let's make sure we're trying to give everybody a fair chance. And we'll do that in Canada as well. For Indigenous people who are in remote areas, they just don't have the access. So that's going to be a theme, I think, for at least the next 6 months, and I would expect for a long time to come. Some of the other things that are kind of exciting in our relationship that have happened over the last 6 months and that we're looking to the future with are things like archaeology. I mentioned I'd spoken with the president of our Social Sciences and Humanities Research Council. The thing that caught his eye was that the University of Toronto, working here with South African and Israeli researchers, have just demonstrated that Wonderwork Cave in the Northern Cape is the oldest inhabited place on Earth for humans and all of our human ancestors. For 2 million years, hominids, Homo sapiens, have lived and worked in this cave. So very excited by that, which draws a lot of attention to the issue of archaeology. But archaeology itself is connected with advancing our common heritage. And it's a great way for Canadians and South Africans to work together. So they're very excited by that. And it's also something that gives us an area of common interest and something that draws attention to the Canada-South Africa relationship. And as they say, there is no bad publicity. I'm not sure that's quite true, but this is good publicity. So we're very much looking forward to working with the University of Toronto and the Social Sciences and Humanities Council and taking that further. One other area that has an important implication for business is judicial cooperation. So I mentioned that 25 years ago, we were very involved in helping South Africa rewrite its constitution. And there's, as I said, some nostalgia for that in Canada. So I thought this would be an interesting area to look at. And so I contacted a number of our institutions in Canada that train our judges and that also have an international dimension. And the response was amazing. In fact, I just received before this meeting this afternoon a message from the Chief Justice of Alberta, former Chief Justice of Alberta, who heads our National Judicial Institute, absolutely enthusiastic about working with South Africa. There are many, many areas we can look at and ways in which we would structure this cooperation. But it's probably going to look like something like webinars where we are looking at cutting edge law, regulatory reform, and so on. And it could be in many fields, but they have suggested that one area would be in commercial law, the latest commercial law. We could be looking at energy, how the transition is going to take place, and what are we learning in each of our countries about that. So really excited about that. The 25th anniversary of the Constitution provides a nice hook to draw people in, but we've got all kinds of people back in Canada looking forward to this. I spoke to your Deputy Minister of Justice about it a couple of weeks ago, and a whole series of other jurists and lawyers here. So they're very interested in finding ways to work together on this. And in fact, I would very much look forward to your thoughts on where we might shape this. I'd like it to be something that is a process over a number of years, but your ideas about how we can best share best practice there would be interesting. One last thing on women and entrepreneurship, and Dershni's on the line, so she knows all about this, but we're looking at something in the energy field. This is particularly around renewables, where we would have senior women in the energy sector in Canada and some other countries mentor women who wish to move up to more senior management in those areas. So the organization in Canada is called WIRE, which is Women in Renewable Energy. I worked with them when I was in Turkey. They actually opened an office in Turkey. They've now opened one in the Gulf as well. They have several in the United States. But it's a vehicle that really addresses that question of, all right, women are doing better in business. They're doing better in institutions, commercial institutions, but they do keep coming up against that glass ceiling. So how do we get them beyond that? And so I think WIRE will play an important role in that. As I said, our next bilateral consultations with South Africa, we'll try to structure in a smaller version, but still important, in the fall, maybe in October. And then by that point, I hope we are now by then doing things in person. So we're very hopeful that we will have either a visit by the Prime Minister to South Africa or a visit by the President to Canada. So my last point will be on the larger canvas that we're working on, which is Africa as a whole. We've had a lot of interest in Canada about how can we reorient our relationship with Africa. Many other countries are doing the same thing. The African Free Trade Agreement, which, as you know, came into force recently, is one vehicle. Of course, its implementation will take quite a long time. There are many implications around it. We've been talking to experts about this over the last few months and thinking about things like, well, where could we play a role that would be helpful to business? And my own view is, having worked in the European Union on CETA and its implementation, I think the starting point always has to be, what is business saying about this? Bureaucrats have their own priorities, politicians do, but at the end of the day, if it isn't creating good business, what's the point? So I think we start there. We keep touching base with business. Among things that we've heard, for example, is, what about regulatory convergence? What about a common mining charter, or a very similar mining charter, or taxation around mining that would apply in all of the countries that are signatory to the agreement? Lots of ideas like that. We look forward to hearing from you on that. And finally, if I can just say one last point, and that's a big thank you to Marcello and his team. Marcello, unfortunately for us, will be moving on this summer. And we really wanted to, recognize all the good work that he's done. I think we've really put the relationship into a new gear, and he's still got more time to go, a few more months to get some more things achieved. But I did want to take this opportunity to thank him and all the members of his team, including a lot of new members like Dershni, who are working very hard to make our trade and our commerce flourish like it never has before. So I think I'll stop there, Mike, and take any questions or comments that people might have.
Thank you very much, High Commissioner. We do have a few questions. Just a reminder that I will acknowledge you using the raise the hand facility. You may also use the chat facility to frame your questions, and I will acknowledge those as well. I'd like to take the prerogative of posing the first question, High Commissioner. I'm reliably informed that our President Ramaphosa today made an announcement regarding 100 megawatts of energy will now be available before approvals are required by companies. Could I have your perspective on how you see this impacting the business in South Africa?
I've heard one thing from business. This is what they wanted. There's lots of ability by business to create their own energy if they have surplus energy to sell it into the grid. So I think it's a great step forward, and welcome it from our perspective. It'll open doors. We just talked about load sharing as we were starting to speak. I've spoken with the CEO of Eskom. They're working hard, I think, but this will help them. This will help provide the energy that South Africa needs, that business needs. And as your population grows and as the economy revives, it's going to be needed more than ever. So I think this is a good step forward and a good signal, I hope, of things to come. So I think it's helping to turn the corner.
Thank you very much, High Commissioner. I see we have a question in our chat facility. Just want to get to that.
Craig Sumption's also got his hand up.
It's Craig Sumption got his hand up. Let's acknowledge Craig. Craig, please unmute.
Thank you, Mike. High Commissioner, thank you. Very good to hear that you've had good bilateral trade discussions with our government. Our government has proven to be very good at talking and talking very well. But finally getting down to delivery and the doing has been lacking. And I'm not sure if you got any sense as to how they plan to implement and how they plan to go about doing a lot more than they have been doing to date.
Yeah, again, I've heard the complaints, including from my colleagues, other ambassadors and so on, but I've come with an open mind. I've worked in a number of African countries. I've worked in Turkey and other developing countries. So my expectations, I think, were realistic coming here. But I have to say, I've had a very surprisingly open reception from many different departments, including DTI, but DIRCO and others. And they, like us as officials, we can't get everything done. The role of the ANC is very important here, and I've had a number of discussions with them as well. Again, my sense is that there is a recognition of the problems. We've talked about energy, but in other areas as well, that there needs to be reform and it needs to come faster. There's also a recognition that there's risks to South Africa, for example, a carbon border adjustment mechanism that would be imposed by other countries if they don't go faster. So the gathering, again, I would not want to bet the farm on this just yet, but I do get a sense of a gathering consensus around a need to move faster. And I think this announcement by the president today is part of that. So, there's a lot of different sectors with different interests here, and we are heading to elections in October, which might move things faster or they might slow them down. I don't know. But I do think I fall on the optimistic side, and I'm aware of, the problems that are out there, and they are, there are significant problems with high unemployment, high crime, corruption. But bit by bit, I think people are chipping away at it. It's going to require a lot of effort, and it isn't going to happen overnight. But the country has great strengths. And interestingly, I think I'm allowed to reveal a conversation I had with the French ambassador also this week, who mentioned Macron's visit. And it was Macron's first visit, which I was surprised to hear, actually. But he came away with a sense that the country, he felt la force of the country. He felt the energy, and he was actually very impressed. So, and Macron has seen quite a bit of the world, including quite a bit of Africa. So, again, I tend to fall on the more optimistic side of things, but, we have to keep our eyes wide open. I think it's valuable and important that the international community, to the extent that we can do it, speaks with, a reasonably unified voice. But I think that's the case. I think we all see where the need for reform is. We all wish South Africa every success. Partly because we have our own trade relationships, but also because if South Africa doesn't succeed, it's going to be very hard for the rest of Africa to succeed. And that's an old cliche, but it remains true. So I think, my sense is that the international community is speaking with a reasonably unified voice. We'll see how the G7 meeting goes, and the G20 comes up shortly after. But the G7 meeting this weekend, I think, will be quite important. I'm trying to come up with, for example, on COVID and the vaccines, a fairly unified position and I would say a broader approach to this problem. We don't want to see Africa left behind. Of course, we've all got to take care of our own populations. That's why governments are elected first and foremost. But I think on issues like that, we can see some convergence. All that to say that the reform agenda is large and necessary, but I do see some signs of progress, at least since I've been here. And I've confirmed that with others, that yes, indeed, in the last 3-4 months, more has happened than people expected. So again, I remain pretty optimistic.
Thank you.
Thank you for that question, Craig, and High Commissioner, thank you for that comprehensive response. I have a question from Sam. What is the position of Canada on the waiver for COVID-19 IP? Would you like to pick that one up, High Commissioner?
Yeah, well, we've said that I think looking back from it, the IP issue is one part of the conversation. We've just made some more contributions just a couple of days ago to COVAX. We're into that for about $1 billion. But IP is an issue that has been raised by South Africa, by India, and a number of others. We are open to coming to a consensus at the WTO on this, but first and foremost, we're focused on what's going to get vaccines in the arms and the jabs of Africans, and it can't only be the IP that will do it. So we're open to discussion about it. Our position is actually quite similar to most countries. I think where South Africa is heading is to make the point emphatically that this is important, and we hear you on that. We hear South Africa's point on that. And we don't want to divide between developing and developed countries over this issue. But we have to build up the capacity to manufacture vaccines. I mentioned that I had discussions with Aspen this week. We're building up our own capacity in Canada. We have to look at the lessons around WHO. There was a report which hasn't received very much publicity, but it came out about a month ago, headed by Helen Clark, the former New Zealand Prime Minister. And there were a number of sensible suggestions about how we should, as an international community, deal with any future pandemics or variants. And the reaction of the WHO at the outset was probably not what we wanted if we were to go back and do it again. So that's one dimension, how we deal with public health, global public health, as a global public good. We need to think that through much more vigorously. So we're open to that discussion on all those elements. We do support COVAX, as well, as I said, with a significant amount of money. But we feel on IP, there's an important discussion to be had. We're there with others in the WTO to find a solution on that. And we think as well that there's a broader approach that we have to take, which will look at all issues, including production, supply chains, what can get over borders, how we distribute the vaccines, and of course the technological questions around cold chains and all the rest of it. So it's a broad approach that we're going to have to take, and we're committed to doing that. And we've said that many times from the Prime Minister on down.
Thank you for that question and the comprehensive reply there, High Commissioner. A question from Lindsay. Thank you, Lindsay. It's a two-part question, so I'll open. How do you see Canadian companies helping the South African public and private sector improve infrastructure service delivery, namely ICT, water and transport, as well as energy?
Well, that will require a comprehensive answer. We have a lot of strengths in those fields in infrastructure and clean tech I mentioned. We need to get the governance right for projects. So if we're looking at the public sector projects, we need to see how that's going to work. Where those are green projects, and by the way, there's a lot of discussion in South Africa, very interesting, around how cities can play an important role, not just the national government or the province, but how cities can play an important role in bringing green infrastructure into play, and also dealing with things like better insulation of buildings. We're all shivering a little bit in the cool weather here. We're actually addressing that in Canada as well in the most recent budget. Quite a lot of money was going for maybe the less exciting part of the green transition, but lower hanging fruit in terms of making our existing buildings and infrastructure much more green. So I think we've got a lot of capacity in Canada, Canadian companies who could do this, providing services, providing physical products as well. But the governance piece will have to be sorted out to some extent. So green or climate finance is going to be a big part of that. As I said, there's a lot of international money, public and private. It's looking for a home. Everybody recognizes the pivotal role that South Africa will play on this, not just on coal. You are the 12th biggest emitter in the world on carbon emissions, but it's not just that. It's also your role in Africa as a whole. But we've got to find a way of marrying these things up. And then we come back to the way in which public projects are rolled out. And I think business wants to be reasonably certain that if they're committing something to a public project, that the regulatory framework is going to facilitate that project and the infrastructure. So we have strengths in, of course, we're not a hot country, we're a cold country, but we have a lot of infrastructure strength because we're a big country, quite a few times bigger than South Africa. And so our history over the last 200 years really has been building up skills in things like rail, where we have Bombardier was of course very active here in the Hout train and Transnet. We've got a lot of strength in water. We do, I think, have more fresh water than any other country in the world. We have a lot of tech, clean tech, as I mentioned, and a lot of these things will be intersected through other technologies that are coming up, where Canada has a lot of strengths. For example, artificial intelligence. We are in Toronto, the third biggest area for startups in that field. and virtually everything from dryland agriculture to the drones that look at the farmers' fields. They're going to be using AI, so we have a lot of strengths in those areas to bring to the fore. As I said before, I think however we engage in your economy, we're going to be looking at that gender lens, and we're looking through the equity lens more broadly as well to make sure that all the strengths are available on our side and your side. But I think in infrastructure, there's a great deal to be done in South Africa, and there's a great deal to be done between South Africa and your African neighbors if this free trade agreement is ever going to be implemented. So a lot of strength there, and a kind of a natural fit between Canadian and South African companies, I think.
Thank you very much, High Commissioner. I appreciate that comprehensive response again. Going to in the meantime, Frick, I acknowledge you, and I'll come to you right after the second part of Lindsay's question. To what extent will Canada look to foster partnerships between Canadian and South African companies in this space? In other words, the space as we've just been referring to, High Commissioner, as well as in pursuing opportunities in the Southern African region?
Well, that is what we are, and the trade team is dedicated to doing. We're looking to matchmake as much as we can. We will use this new technology, just like we're doing tonight, to, I think, go faster in doing that. I don't think people have fully absorbed the benefits yet of this transition to a more virtual culture or a hybrid culture, if that's where we come out, so that we can reach a broader audience. And I think as we do the matchmaking, maybe in the past we put companies together who are in the same sector. I think the advantage of what we're going to be heading towards and what we will midwife, if you like, is to put sectors that may not naturally or traditionally have worked together. And that's what I mentioned in the area of clean tech and mining. And there are probably many others. So clean tech and mining, and for example, our community of colleges. In Canada, we have 140 colleges. Who are very adept at working internationally, building up the skills. Let's say it's skills in infrastructure or the transition from coal mining to another type of mining. They've got huge expertise in that. I was just speaking to the president of our association. It's called CICAN. But bringing her organization into the conversation between businesses to say, we could do more, but we lack skills. And I hear that a lot in South Africa. The education system provides a certain level, but not what we need. So to take one example in the health sector, the president of CICAN was telling me that they've got an entire package that they've created. There's 120, I think it's 120 courses offered by Canadian colleges in the fields that are related to vaccine manufacturing alone. So if we can mobilize some of those resources to facilitate the marriage between our sectors, infrastructure and others, then that's a real force multiplier for more traditional work that we've been doing through the Trade Commissioner Service or through my office to enhance the business ties between our two countries. I think, we look to our mutual strengths. I think you have a huge strength in science and technology. It's at the higher end. We've got a lot of strength in those areas as well. We've got infrastructure strength, you've got mining strength, so do we, but it's to find the complementarities. And I do think that, great as our two economies are together, there's still two middle power economies. And where the real potential lies is when we go to the global level. So if you could put our two partners together, Canadian and South African, and we can take on the world, or maybe we start with Africa, but I think that's the real potential. That's where the real gold lies. It's not so much in the minds of Canada or South Africa, but it's in going global. And that's where we need to look. We've got good financing. We've got EDC. And we've got other sources of finance in Canada. A lot of pools of capital in Canada. We're very big savers there, so a lot of capital is available at reasonable cost. So we could potentially supercharge some of these partnerships so that we're looking beyond just the local or the regional market and seeing how we can fit globally. I think that's the real interest of both our countries, and that's what I think would be very, very exciting beyond the bilateral.
Thank you very much, Lindsay. Thank you so much for that question. Frick, I'll ask you to unmute. Over to you.
Commissioner, thank you so much for that background, and I'm so grateful for Lindsay's questions. So she's asked the broad question, and I want to be a bit more pragmatic, because we are accused in South Africa that we talk and we don't do. So I want to get to the do things. What resonates greatly with me is your referral to Africa as a whole, because that has resonance with me in particular. If you look at our continent, we have about 600 million children under the age of 24. And we have, and I want to get back to two other points, the science and technology, skills development and education. So we have about 1 million quality, I have to define it, but say 1 million quality seats in tertiary education. So the provision for that need is far below what is required. And then in South Africa, of all eligible kids that can go to university, the public sector only can accommodate about 40%, at most 50%. The others have to rely on whatever to get their tertiary education. So entrepreneurs or educational entrepreneurs or educationists like us, so we have a very large, one of the largest private universities, which we are promoting in South Africa into the rest of Africa. But when there is collaboration, tertiary collaboration between countries, it's mostly between the public universities and not really with private universities. So my question would be, how could one facilitate that kind of collaboration even with private entities, although we may not be up there really without subsidies where the public universities are, but indeed we deliver a big service to the continent. That's part A of the question. And part B is, since you have referred to the capital available, there's even opportunity for investment in tertiary education in the rest of Africa.
Yeah, those are very good questions. I won't claim to have all the answers tonight to that. It's a huge question. I do think a couple of things come to mind. One is, I fully accept your point. I mean, it's great to talk about the potential of Africa, or the potential of South Africa in its young people as our countries get older, but it's untapped unless we can have the education. And the education can't just be any education. I mean, obviously there are basic skills and basic education, that primary stuff, but it has to be education that's geared to employment. And that's where I mentioned our CICAN, our Association of Colleges, very much focuses on. They start with the employment and then they work backwards. So a lot of projects, I've seen them in various parts of Africa in particular, you know, it starts with, we'd like to have education, or we'd like to have TVET, for example, and what you get is a whole bunch of people that are qualified to do, you know, barbing, to do hair salons, and that's fine, but you can only have so many on one street. You need to start with, what does the economy require, and at what level, and how do you bring the private sector in to support private or public institutions, so that they themselves then become more attractive, because it's known that if you go to your institution, when you finish, you have, as in Canada with our colleges, you have about a 90 to 95% chance you're going to be employed in your field within 6 months. So that makes it very viable, and it's also less expensive, and it's a 1 or 2 year commitment, not a 4-year commitment. We all have this difficulty with TVET. It's seen as less sexy, and people don't want it. They want the prestige and so forth. But I think we have to have that mental shift, because not everybody should have a PhD in political science. We need people who can be engineers, who can be carpenters, who can be solar panel specialists, and so on. That's really what has to be done. And in fact, even in Canada, we suffer greatly from the lack of skilled trades. It's a major crimp on our economy. And I think in South Africa and Africa as a whole, you know, we're in a way disenfranchising so many young people. And COVID has, of course, made that worse to some extent, because they're not giving them the skills. So all that to say, in my view, we should use the institutions like the ones you're referring to, whether it's public or private, doesn't really matter, but less emphasis on elite schools. Elite schools kind of take care of themselves. In South Africa, those with the money, they can go to Harvard, they can go to Oxford, wherever they want to go, that's fine. I think our education strategy needs to focus much more on that huge group of younger people who aren't getting the opportunities. And it may mean that we have to bring them up a little bit somehow in a way that maybe the system hasn't done so well for them. But let's get them to where they can have useful skills, and that means working with with the chamber. I mean, what skills do you need over 2, 3, 5 years, and then work backwards. That's a strategy we're trying to employ in Canada. We've used it in other countries that this institution has worked in. But I think we have to go from the theoretical, it's great, there's all these young people, to the practical, but let's put them into employment that's meaningful for them, and let's get them there quickly. Now, the technology, which again we've had to supercharge because of COVID, can't help. Before the pandemic, people were using technology to have massive online courses. Not all that successfully. It wasn't seen as all that desirable. But I think now we've moved on. So we're going to have to assess that and what makes sense. It's probably, again, a bit of a hybrid. I was on a call this week with an organization called Ditchley. It's a think tank in the UK. We were talking about the future of education. And I think we all agreed that there's no getting away from the need to have small interaction with a teacher, a professor. You do need that to round out a student to really come away with a proper education. But it doesn't have to be the whole thing. And it allows a student, if we use the technology, to get more sources of information. It gets us to the question of credentials, however. Credentials, the credential industry, if you like, is worth trillions around the world. And we have to be convinced that the credentials that are being offered are valid. After all, how will an employer know if they've got an employee who has the skills they need? That's a big question, and we have to look at that. So I think all of those kinds of things we should examine in the High Commission, in our trade program. Big conversations, but a lot of people thinking about these things now, and you can't emphasize enough how important it is. The equity as well comes into that. I mean, it's incredibly important that everybody has equal opportunity. At least we strive to get there. And so education becomes a facilitator of that, which builds more social harmony, which will reduce crime, and there are many, many benefits. But it does run very heavily through getting a successful education strategy in place. We, as I said, took 750,000 foreign students in Canada. Our institutions are extremely heavily oriented towards international engagement, both inward and outward. So I think Canada is a kind of education superpower, if you like, very well regarded. So this is a strength that we have, and we should be deploying that and working with you.
Thank you so much. Appreciate it.
Frick, thank you for that question. As happens so often on occasions such as this, we get so engrossed in these engagements, we seem to run out of time. Belinda, I see you, and I'd ask you to unmute your mic, please. Pose your question. Belinda? Belinda, over to you.
Yep, can you hear me?
Yes, we can hear you.
Good evening, sir. I would love to ask you this question. In the earlier moments of your presentation and your words to us, you mentioned you wanted to increase the number of students, particularly traveling into Canada to study. I would like to ask you how you can possibly assist us with obtaining business and also student visas. Thank you very much.
Actually, I'm glad you asked that question because it's a perennial one that's important. Interestingly, our immigration department and our minister remains committed to high levels of immigration to Canada, to high levels of students, and we have, of course, a backlog because of COVID. But our immigration folks at the High Commission are working overtime on student visas, for example. There was a commitment that I believe anybody who got their application in, I think it was in May, we would do everything we can to make sure they're processed in time for them to go to school in the fall. Now, I know one of the issues we have is that we have a different school calendar from you, which does complicate things. Again, maybe, as we evolve post-COVID to a more hybrid approach, maybe we'll shed some of that old think in the way we do our calendars, which after all is organized around the 19th century harvest time, and I'm not sure that it suits our needs all that well these days, but in any case, the commitment is still there. And so on visas, and for business, the same thing. We want to return business people to Canada to come and have a look, to invest. So unlike some other countries, we kept as much as we could until COVID, open borders. From refugees to students to business people, we want to make sure that Canada is seen as open. I mentioned we have an election coming up probably this year, but I can tell you on this one, there's no party, no political party in Canada, major one anyway, that sees it very differently. There's a very strong consensus in Canada that we are international and we will stay international, and that means facilitating people coming in. I know that our websites for some of these things are probably a little less clear than they could be. There's work afoot on improving things. And what I would say to you is that, if you do have concerns on the business side, we're here to help that. I mean, I personally can't get directly involved. The decision making is not in my hands, but we can help you go into the right channels so that if something's coming up, we'll try to get you there. Hopefully, once we have all got our vaccinations and the COVID crisis is diminished, we'll be able to move things back into high gear. But definitely, we want to make that happen, and that commitment has been reinforced even in COVID.
Thank you very much, sir. Appreciate it.
Linda, thank you for that question. High Commissioner, unfortunately, we've come to the end of our time. In fact, we're 5 minutes over. But I don't think anybody's noticed. It's been an incredibly engaging conversation, and for one, I noticed the frank and transparent manner in which you've taken all the questions and provided insightful responses to all the questions. So thank you very much from our side. It is now my pleasure to call upon Mr. Craig Sumption of Hatch Africa for some concluding remarks and then to a vote of thanks. Craig, over to you, please. Unmute.
Thank you, Mike, and thank you to you and the Chamber once again for hosting a wonderful session. It really is great and informative. High Commissioner, thank you for your time. Very much appreciated. Very good to hear that you got such a positive reception from your Canadian colleagues. That is always good to hear. But also it's good for us to hear your perspective as well. Very often we can be living, working in our specific bubbles, and you carry on driving on that front, and you don't necessarily step back and get a broader picture and a better perspective. And thank you for giving us that broader perspective outside of our norm here. You mentioned earlier on the optimism. You're an optimistic person, and I think from that perspective, you're in a great country. Despite all that South Africans have been through, I think overall South Africans are still a very optimistic nation. Optimistic that things will come right. We'll be able to get things sorted out. There's a long road ahead, no doubt about it, but we're going to get there. We're going to get them sorted out. So it's good to hear your optimism on that front, and I think that's going to work well within the country. So thank you again for your time, and we wish you well with your stay in South Africa.
Thanks very much.
Craig, thank you very, very much. And on that note, I would just like to urge you all to keep watching us. Visit our website on www.sakincham.com. We've got some interesting engagements coming up over the next few weeks. And once again, to all our members and partners, thank you for your support. And High Commissioner, to you again, thank you to you and your team in South Africa for the wonderful opportunity to collaborate. Thank you and good night all.